Good evening, everyone, and thanks again for the kind offer to talk to you this evening. With 71% of the world's surface being water or ocean waters, tonight I'm going to try and look at what sort of person goes under the ocean for a living, for their job, indeed as a career. What are they doing down there? What are they doing down there, indeed, under the keels of some of your yachts? What is their daily life like down there? Their routines and their very business. What is it they are actually doing down there? I hope in this short talk to be able to fill in some of those details. I can't cover everything, and I'll try to answer your questions at the end. I'll avoid technical details as much as I can. I'm going to cover aspects of living on board a submarine and being underwater. And I'm going to cross-populate between both diesel submarines, which you see in the picture now, and nuclear submarines of different types. The submarine you see in the picture, actually, Otis, that was my first submarine. I joined it in Tromsø in Norway, and that was an adventure in itself. And I served in many capacities on the submarine, eventually ended up being second in command. So let's initially talk about the people themselves. Who's down there? The rank structure in a submarine is no different from that you find in any navy, in surface navy, though the trades are slightly different, and they normally have a submarine specialization after their technical specification. There's an unwritten sort of elitist core that runs through the whole cadre of people that are on the submarines. They're highly trained, and they need to know their submarine intensively. And it takes longer to become a nuclear engineering officer than it does become a doctor. About 7 to 8 years before we actually qualify as a nuclear engineering officer. So is there any perks, you might ask? Why they do this? There are some perks. They have extra pay, which is nice. And when a submarine goes into a foreign harbor, everyone gets put ashore in nice hotels. So there's a couple of extra perks. That doesn't apply to one type of submarine I'll cover later in the talk. What about the health issues on board? You can think it's not very healthy to be underneath the water. And there's a measure of health risks, I guess. Your physical fitness obviously has to be looked at carefully. Your eyesight will suffer slightly when you're being underwater, but I'll back up. So used to using your eyes to look short distances in the submarine, everyone is close by your eyes. So when you come back from long patrols, you have to adjust your eyesight a little bit for the first few days, and it's advisable not to drive. In the diesel submarines, they have a very poisonous atmosphere most of the time inside the boat, and it's not unusual to have very high levels of CO2. Talking of fitness, I used to take my racing bicycle on board the submarine in bits. I used to break it apart in small pieces and store it under the torpedo loading hatch, and then reassemble it when I got to a foreign harbour, which gave me the chance to cycle in different parts of the world. How do they live on board? We have all three ranks, that's the officers, the senior rates, and the ratings, live in separate accommodations, but the CO on all submarines has his own cabin, but he invariably eats with the wardroom, the rest of the officers. So what sort of people are they? Well, there's a common, thing you could say. There's composure under stress. An ability to get along with others is key, and a very high degree of professionalism. And obviously, claustrophobics invariably do not apply for this job. Everyone's safety underwater is only as good as the weakest link, so every man has to be highly trained. This means knowing your systems sensibly, and if you change submarines, you have to relearn some of the systems and get signed off. And that's what the image is on the lower right. If someone's a book, they're going through the system to get signed off as to their knowledge. Additionally, to ensure safety, we often have a two-man rule. When we're doing things on board, we have one person doing the work and someone will check it off on a list behind them. Much the same as you have on an airplane for anything that has an element of danger to it. This is my old submarine, and it's now, unfortunately, or some fortunately, we're going to look at the Oberon class, but it's now a museum. It's now in Sassnitz City Harbour on Rügen Island in Germany. So I guess Germany didn't have too many U-boats left after the last bust up to stack their own tourist spots, so they used one of ours. Notice the shape of the submarine, and the tanks you can see on the side are ballast tanks. Inside that, there's a cylindrical pressure hull. The next slide will show you some aspects, some very simple, and we'll be covering these during the talk as to the relevance of the foreplanes, afterplanes, and bridge. And so it's interesting that this submarine that I served on quite extensively ended up being a museum, as did one of the nuclear submarines I served on as well. So the tanks you see there are ballast tanks, and some of them are fuel tanks. These submarines have a very long range, over 10,000 nautical mile range. Let's have a brief look inside. This sort of layout is common to practically all submarines, as you'll see when I show you a nuclear submarine shortly. The boat itself is about 10.5 CNC yacht lengths long and about 1 CNC yacht wide in its widest part. Torpedo tubes, sonar sets up the front end, then a space for accommodations. That's the different types of ranks and ratings. And I've got a clip to show you what it looks like later on in the presentation. In the middle, we have a control room, sonar room, wireless room, galley and toilets. And again, I'll show you a clip of those very shortly. In the center, I'll just briefly mention that there are 4 toilets on this submarine, but invariably when we went on some missions, particularly to the Barents Sea, we would lose 2 of those toilets for what are called sneaky gear or specialist gear. So we'd have over 70 men sharing just 2 toilets. This is the actual control room of HMS Otis, the submarine you saw in the first pictures. And I want to just bring your attention to a few items, and they'll come to the fore when I come in the presentation later on. First of all, we have the 2 periscopes in the center of the picture. The attack periscope at the front there, that's a monocular and has a much smaller exposure at the top of the mast. I'll show you that later on. And then the search periscope, which is binocular, and it actually has a seat. You actually sit on that seat and use the periscope and go round and round while you're doing your watch on the periscope. The hatch above you there leads to the conning tower. Normally there'd be a ladder there. The ladder's been taken away in this picture, but that's how you'd come in and out of the submarine. You go up to the tower and the bridge. On the right-hand side, you can see some valves there. Those are the main blow valves for blowing the main ballast tanks to get rid of the water in order to come up. Let's look at the bridge area very briefly. You can see there the conning tower, which is the center of the submarine, and the bridge on top. And you see the periscopes exposed there. So the attack periscope, as I said, is very narrow at the top, designed so it doesn't create a wake. The picture on the right is obviously purely for photographic purposes. You'll never see a submarine expose its mast in this fashion. The search radar, an intercept, the snort intake where you take air into the diesels, a radio mast, and the snort exhaust mast. And even when you're snorting, the snort exhaust mast is normally a few feet underwater, so the exhaust just bubbles up to the surface. The snort intake is exactly what it is. That's where we drag air in from the outside to feed the diesels. Now we just move aft into the engine room.
All drains up now?
Yeah. In the engine room there's 2 very large.
Just shut off the drain.
Very hot, very
Okay.
You want it open?
Yeah, just want to see this drop.
Yeah.
No, open, shut it. So just go straight through.
Shut it or open?
Yeah, it's 30 pound there. You leave it open.
Yep.
You got to try to seal it sometimes as well.
I'm going to draw your attention to the cylinder head. Now we move on to the next type of submarine I'd like to just cover in tonight's talk, and that's the nuclear fast attack, or hunter killer as it's sometimes called. And this is a picture of HMS Courageous. I did serve on this submarine as well for quite an extensive time as the third in command and the operations officer and navigation officer. This submarine is nuclear powered, so it just has a nuclear reactor. It doesn't carry nuclear weapons, it just has a nuclear reactor rather than the diesel engines as you saw in the last clip. I draw your attention to the built-in breathing system at the top there, and I'll come back to talk about that a little later. The picture you can see there is the divesman's plane. There's 2 joysticks, one for the person who keeps the depth, another one for who keeps the course. In the bottom of the picture, you'll see just an image of a sub-harpoon missile, and these submarines carry carry both, actually, harpoon missiles and torpedoes. Just put the two together, roughly the same size in length. The nuclear submarine is much broader, has much more space inside it. But again, the layout is not that dissimilar to what you see on the diesel submarine. Torpedo tubes, sonar up the front end, accommodations, center there with the periscopes and the control center. And then after that, you have the pressurized nuclear reactor, the steam generators, providing steam to the turbine room, and the turbo generators generate electricity. And there is also a diesel engine back there still. Additionally, it has a battery bank the same way as a diesel submarine. A couple of interesting features for you. One is the fact that there's an anchor. So submarines can actually anchor underwater. So this is an interesting evolution. So all the controls can be done whilst you're diving. Additionally, you see a thing called an egg beater at the back, and that's a sort of get you home motor device, much like a trawling electrical thing you'd lower over the back of your bass boat or a boat when you're out fishing. So it's electrically driven, and it's sort of get you home last gasp, so to speak. As I said, it carries both torpedoes and missiles. And next clip, I'm going to just show you the Harpoon missile being fired against a target. And this is something I did out in San Diego. I took Courageous out to San Diego through the Panama and spent a long time in San Diego firing these missiles to certify the submarine for that particular weapon system. It's in slow motion, obviously, to capture as the missile comes out of the water. So the missile initially bumps up to about a couple of thousand feet, or as low as we can get it, and then it comes down, and then it'll go along at sea level. Here you can see it coming in before it hits the ship there, target. When I was in San Diego, we used to have the targets we hit there were with missiles without warheads, and the ships would have film cameras on at fast speed. We'd actually be able to see the wake of the missile as it crossed the sea towards the target. The missiles actually make a wake in the sea, they fly so low. And if you can see in the picture, and we can see it, it's actually broken the back of that ship where it hit. The unfortunate aspect of politics and war is the Falklands campaign, which I took part in. I was in HMS Courageous. We were north of the Falkland Islands, and our sister submarine Conqueror was south of the islands as the aircraft carrier of the opposition. It's a great sadness that so many young men lost their lives in this particular incident because the opposition didn't read the history books and know the British will come anywhere for a fight. And so we came 7,000 miles to the Falklands Islands to get it sorted out, and so it did. And the picture on the right is Conqueror as it returned to its base. And as I said before, the submarine I served on is actually now a museum in Devonport, and it's open to the public, well, normally open to the public, obviously COVID, not at the moment. The next type of submarine is the strategic nuclear submarine. These are large, very large submarines, and their role is really to spend their time slowly in the depths of the ocean, waiting for an order to fire the missiles. That's their main priority. They have to be ready within 15 minutes of receiving a firing order. The missile has to be leaving the tube, or missiles. They carry 16 of them. They have to be able to leave the tubes and on their way to their targets. So it's a different type of submarine to the Hunter Killer I just showed you. You very rarely see these submarines in any foreign harbors except when they go to Cape Canaveral to do their dummy firings. So these missiles go into outer space, so to speak, and deliver their payload of multiple thermonuclear warheads to the designated target. There's a very, very even higher degree of professionalism on this particular submarine. Very, very high degree of professionalism for office reference. Let's now wander through a couple of types of submarine and talk about living on board. This is a passageway down on HMS Otis, very narrow passageways. You can see some bunks there. There's always someone sleeping or in some capacity because of the watch keeping. That again, the sleeping is obviously haphazard sometimes. And well, let me just show you what it's like on, let's tour a diesel submarine, an Oberon class. Here you see the accommodations in the front end. This is where the ratings live. We're about 30 people in this space. This is the senior rates mess. There are about 18 or 20 people in this place. Again, a lot of the bunks are shared. So your hot bunk, so to speak. The next room you'll see is the wardroom. About 6 to 8 officers in here, 8 officers. And you see the planks there to keep you in when you're rolling around on the surface. These submarines do spend a lot of time on the surface. And finally, you'll see the captain's cabin. The captain, again, even on these small submarines, still has his own little cabin. Now let's look at a tour inside HMS Courageous. The first image you see is the fire control system for the Harpoon missiles and the torpedoes. And then we'll just a quick tour through the submarine itself. Periscope you can see there. There's the helm's position I showed you previously. There's a plaque about our missile firings, a poster about noise. I'll come back to that shortly. The scene inside part of the galley. There's the bunks, one of the bunk spaces, and they use any loose space is used to accommodate your own belongings. And this is actually the officers' sleeping space. And this space is the twin officers' space where the XO and the engineering officer would sleep. There is a bar on board, and there's an unwritten law. Obviously, you do not use the bar when you're at sea. Here we are at the 4 ends, the front end of the submarine with the 6 missile tubes. Now, please take a quick note of the red suit on the left-hand side. I'll come back to discuss that a little later on. And you saw the 6 missile tubes there, or 6 torpedo tubes. And so we could sometimes, if we wanted to, we could fire a salvo of missiles, reload, and send another pack. And the initial Harpoon missiles would wait. They'd be sent out on a dummy trail, so that then all the missiles would come to the target at the same time. Let me just talk now about air quality on board the submarine, living actually in the submarine and what it means. Every man on board produces about 2 pounds of CO2 per day. That has to be got rid of and try and keep the air breathable. It's a constant challenge on diesel submarines that have nothing very sophisticated. And often we would have levels well 30 to 40 times what you'd have on up there on your yacht. We'd have well above 1-2% CO2 was not uncommon sometimes. We correct this by burning oxygen candles. This is a chemical reaction where you burn it and it gives off oxygen. And we also scrub the air using those green cans. You draw air through them. The cans contain sodium hydroxide, and you just draw air and it absorbs CO2. On a nuclear submarine, because they have unlimited power, they can break down water into hydrogen and oxygen. We can ditch the hydrogen and keep the oxygen, and the air can be scrubbed using electrical equipment and scrubbers. So the air on board a nuclear submarine is much cleaner, much easier to look after. And in fact, effectively, you could stay underneath forever. The only thing you run out of is food, and I'll discuss that a little later. So that's the air. And again, at top left down, you see the breathing system that I initially and also brought your attention to previously. Now, water and domestics. Let's talk about that. Water on board a nuclear submarine is obviously no big issue. On a diesel submarine, it is. There's very limited fresh water. So on long patrols, if we went up the Barents, we would be rationed to 1 sink of water per man per week. That was it, to do any of your personal hygiene. The toilets you see there are flushed using low pressure seawater. Obviously, we don't shave, and our uniforms on the diesel submarine are anything you want to wear. There's no real uniform code. Now, human toilets and human waste are obviously a big part of living underneath, so let's cover that subject right now. So the nasties are collected in what we call a slop drain and sewerage tank, much like the holding tank you have on a yacht. And in a diesel submarine, the only way we get rid of it is actually blowing it out using compressed air. And we can only do that when we're at periscope depth or on the surface, because the tank is not designated for full diving depth. And once you've blown it out, you then have to vent it inboard, which obviously has a certain smell about it, an aroma. and we try and do that when we're snorting to try and drag that foul air out of the submarine. Now, nuclear submarines have the luxury of being able to pump out their nasties using a pumping system at any depth. I want to bring your attention, though, to, if you've watched Christmas Vacation, you know Uncle Eddie and the shitter's full. Well, on one particular nuclear submarine, I was the opposite crew, but anyway, they had an incident where they couldn't use their toilet system. Well, use the toilet system, but couldn't use the tank, couldn't be pumped out. So everyone on board had to use plastic bags for their human waste, and then the human waste was put into the gas ejection system for putting outside the hull. So a very unpleasant experience. But because they're on that strategic submarine, they weren't allowed to break patrol, they weren't allowed to communicate. They just had to get on and sort the problem out themselves. So it just shows what has to be done when it has to be done. Food and feeding obviously is a huge morale issue on board of submarines. There's a galley, but again, on a diesel submarine, there's quite a lot of constraint by how much power you have in the batteries and how much water you have as to how much you can use the galley. So quite often on long patrols where we're in our silent routines, where we want to try and keep things down, we would have to shut the galley down or just go to cold meals only for a day or so out of the galley, which is not very good for morale, but that's a fact of life. On the nuclear submarine, no problem. They have unlimited power, water to prepare food. Now, one of the limitations of any submarine is how long the crew can stay out underwater because of how much food you have. Now, interesting enough, for the Falklands campaign on Courageous, we lined all the decks with tin food. So we had about 18 inches of tin food on all the decks, covered over with hardboard. And so the ceilings or the deck heads were much lower than normal. And we had to eat our way through that first before we could start using the stuff in the main stores. It made for a very interesting dive when we dived for the first time because the submarine was so heavy. Now, waste disposal is obviously a lot of men, over 100 men on the nuclear submarines, generate a lot of waste. So garbage disposal. There's a very short clip here. It's slightly old-fashioned, but the process is the same. He shows this put into linen bags, the rubbish. They should put into like a vertical torpedo tube. Nowadays, we actually compress all the gas into a tin tube, a large tin tube, which is then put into the same ejector system. And the tin tube is hydraulically compressed. So you compress all your garbage into like a steel can. The steel can goes into that refuse device and it's flushed overboard. So the submarine is basically pooing as it goes along with these tin cans going to the seabed. Let's look at one common hazard on submarines. This is the large battery cells they have on board. These are massive batteries. Each battery, although it only gives 2 to 3 volts, is actually a significant piece of hardware. It's about as tall as a man, weighs about half a ton, and has 20 gallons of sulfuric acid inside them. Above a certain voltage, when they're being charged, they give off hydrogen gas, which has to be vented off overboard, obviously. This is a very dangerous thing to have on board. It's fairly obvious what the utility is on a diesel submarine because they actually propel the submarine. The submarine diesel engines just charge the batteries themselves provide the power to actually drive the submarine. But on a nuclear submarine, they are a tertiary device because you actually, if the nuclear reactor scrams or is shut down, you only have about 20 minutes of steam left for electrical generation and propulsion. And therefore, the battery gives you that small window of opportunity to just get things going and for life-saving systems to make sure all the systems are still working and enable perhaps you to recover or get to the surface. So the battery is a critical part of the nuclear submarine, as it is indeed on the diesel submarine. On the diesel submarine, they only charge the batteries obviously when they're at periscope depth, using the diesels and snorting, bringing the air in through that snort mask I showed you earlier. Now, the thing about lead-acid batteries is that if you introduce seawater into them or near them, you get an instantaneous, very nasty chemical reaction and a fire with ammonia gas and a disaster. HMS, the Canadian Submarine Scrutiny, learnt this very hard lesson. They were running on the surface off the northwest coast of Ireland with both the hatches open to the bridge, and seawater came down, went into the battery compartment, immediately started a fire, and one young officer lost his life, and many others on board were injured. Not a very happy incident. Additionally, more recently, we had the Argentine submarine was lost, the San Juan. Again, the same thing. The snorkeling system in this case was leaking, and the seawater got into the batteries with a fire, and all men were lost. And it was only just recently, a year or so ago, they actually found the wreck 800 meters down the Atlantic. So there's a key thing there. So I say accidents on submarines rarely turn out well. It's a very unforgiving environment underwater. I've talked about this a couple of times during the talk, and I want to bring it now to a head and talk about the built-in breathing system which runs through the submarine. In the event there's any form of gas, or it's toxic, or there's fire or smoke, you have to don this breathing mask. You plug in, as you see by the top left, into an outlet, and then you can breathe by drawing a small vacuum inside your mask. The air flows to your face. To move around the submarines, you have to disconnect yourself from one supply and move along to the next one. When you disconnect, you cannot breathe. Obviously, the mask is airtight, and you need a lot of self-control, composure as you move through the submarine using this fleeting as you disconnect, reconnect, disconnect, and so on. And one of our drills is just to cover your mask over with tape, and you then have to find your way around some parts of the submarine. It's a drill I used to dread doing. I hated it, but it's something we had to do. And indeed, this came into, it actually worked out because on HMS Otis, we went through a period of having hydraulic starter fires underneath the control room, and it was filled with grey smoke, and we had to put these on for real and survive for real. So it's a very necessary device, and these are carried on both diesel and nuclear submarines. So what if everything goes wrong and you end up on the bottom? How do submariners get out of the submarine if it's on the bottom and can't get back up? They're all trapped on the bottom. What do they do? How do you get out? There's two methods. Well, there's actually three methods of getting out. I'll describe the ones which are unaided, so to speak. There's two methods of getting out. We can use what we call just a regular tower escape, or we can use a rush escape. The tower escape is where you let one man at a time into the tower on the left there. Once he's in, you close the lower lid, you fill the thing with seawater, which then equalizes with the seawater pressure outside. He will be breathing off a connection in his red suit there, which connects into a valve in the tower. And he breathes and he fills his hood with air. Once the pressure is equalized between the water inside the tower and sea pressure, the upper lid will open and he'll float to the surface. So that's one man at a time can escape or go up and tell people up above what's happening down below. The other option is, and this may have to be done, is the rush escape. Here you pressurize the inside of the submarine to the same pressure as the outside, that's the air pressure, by deliberately flooding that part of the submarine. You then fleet yourself around that particular compartment, get yourself ready, and then because the air and the water in there is the same pressure as the seawater outside, you need to get out quickly or you're going to get the bends. So the idea is and that's why it's called a rush escape. One by one, you duck under the water, find the entrance to the tower, which is down underneath the water, and then again, up you go. So here he's been told it's okay to go. You'll duck under, come up into the tower, and up he goes. And then one by one, you'll escape using this type of approach. So two methods there, the tower or the rush escape. Neither is a very pleasant experience, I can tell you from my own. I've done that. You have to do this every 3 years in the submarine corps when I was there. The other option, more fancy, and this is what the Americans have generated, and this is the deep sea recovery vessel. And this mounts over any submarine's escape hatch, which forms a watertight and pressure-tight seal. So that this acts, so any large submarine can act as the mothership, In fact, on HMS Repulse, I served on, we did serve as a mother submarine for one such exercise, and we had a diesel submarine placed on the bottom at about 200 or 300 foot, and then we used this mini submarine to transfer people between one submarine and another very successfully. So quite an interesting evolution to open your hatches when you're 200 or 300 foot underwater and see people coming in and out of the submarine. The submarine was painted white, as you saw in the picture there, so the mini submarine, as it approaches the mothership, can see exactly where it's going and avoid a collision. Okay, let's assume that we're going to go to sea now, and let's see what we do when we get to sea. So let's take our submarine to sea first, and then get ourselves dived. Now, going to sea is no different from going to sea in your yacht in many ways. You leave harbour, you prepare yourself properly, you make sure that the submarine is fully secured for sea, everything's lashed down properly, noise rounds, all the normal rounds, storing, nothing different. And so in piloted waters, it's no different from being on board your yacht and going through piloted waters. The difficulty is that you have a very small bridge, so charts up there, everything has to be run from down below with one or two people on the bridge actually controlling the ship. Normally, once you've left harbour and you're on the surface, you'll have one officer on the bridge with a lookout. So a watchkeeping officer and a lookout were normally on the bridge. And so where are we going to? Where we're going to go? We're going to go to somewhere where it's safe to dive. That's obviously the key question here. Now, on our way to getting to safe to dive, we have obviously one danger is being actually on the surface itself. Diesel submarines like the Oberon or HMS Otis ride rough weather quite well in rough seas. They generally tend to ride up the waves, and if you can get the speed right in the stern sea, you can manage it quite well. But at some point, it becomes obviously impossible to be on the bridge with the action of the sea, and you have to come below. So you come below and you keep your watch actually on the periscope below while still on the surface. Now, this is not for the faint of heart, because at this stage, the submarine is pitching, rolling and gyrating around. You have the smell of the diesel and the sound and the noise of the diesels, and you have to sit on that seat there, the search periscope, and go round and round looking through the periscope to keep a good watch. So this is obviously vomit inducing. And so the standard procedure is you have to have a plastic bucket between your knees, and that's where you vomit into rather than throwing it all over the floor or down the periscope well. And that's a real nuisance because the periscope well has heaters at the bottom, so it makes a real mess if you vomit down there. Obviously, red lighting at night, no different from what you would do on your yacht, perhaps. But you keep your watch down below until you reach an area where it's safe to dive. Now, on the nuclear submarines, they're much larger, much heavier, and on the surface act differently to the diesel submarine. And I had one particular unpleasant experience off the coast of Ireland, just near where the continental shelf drops off. I was off the watch. I was there with one lookout. It was not that rough, but it was a large sort of sea running, and it looked a fairly regular sort of night watch. It was moonlight, and I just, out my eye, caught the moon glinting off a very large wave, like a huge swell, way above the height of the submarine. I can't even think how tall it was, and I knew that we were about to go under the submarine was not going to ride up over this huge wave, and we were going to go under. I told the lookout to hang on. We were going under. We shouted that we were going under. I grabbed hold of the bridge there, and sure enough, we were under. The depth gauge down below read about 70 feet briefly. My ears popped. I was completely knocked out. Well, not knocked out, but took the wind out of my sails because of the cold water and being underwater suddenly. The submarine rose up well eventually, and I was able to use the voice. The microphone worked fine, and I ordered the submarine stopped. As I looked around, well, I couldn't find the lookout, and I assumed that I'd lost him overboard. But within a few seconds, I heard him shouting and screaming down below. He got washed down inside the fin. He was a bit banged up, but other than that, it was fine. and we were both relieved of our watch, and the submarine then kept a periscope watch for the rest of the time until we reached our diving position. So how do we go about diving? So on the right, you see the procedure. You open the vents, the submarine goes down, you close the vents, put air in, and up you come. Very, very simple. So the ballast tanks are free flooding, they're open at the bottom, and on the surface they have the air there, which keeps the water out. You let the air out, water comes in, submarine goes down. Submarines have very little actually reserve buoyancy, actually. So on the surface, if they get hit by another ship, there's a danger of them sinking because they don't have much buoyancy. They're designed to sink. So therefore, if you puncture the ballast tanks, they will sink. I'll go through a procedure of diving. So you initially let the air out of the ballast tanks. Then you put about a 2-degree bow down angle using the planes, and then you drive yourself underwater. So the water makes you sort of neutrally buoyant, not too much negatively buoyant. And so about 2 degrees bow down. You increase that to 5 degrees once the stern is well underwater. Then you start to level off, and then you'll go briefly up to shake out any bubbles, or any air that's caught under the casing, and then you arrive at your safe depth. Fairly simple procedure. I'll next show you a clip of a submarine doing an actual dive. Here he is opening the main vents, letting the air out of the tanks. Planes there to dive, you can see that.
Two down,
Two down, sir.
4 casing under.
Her Majesty's submarine Warspite is one of the Royal Navy's 13 nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines. Its role in wartime would be to hunt and to sink Russian submarines.
5 down, 100 feet, then back to 65 feet.
There he's doing the oscillation. He's going to come back to periscope depth. He's not going to go down to safe depth. He's just going to come back to periscope depth.
During the Falklands conflict, Warspite patrolled the South Atlantic. It was her sister submarine, HMS Conqueror, that sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano.
And note, just below, once you get just below periscope depth, the submarine would disappear.
No less than 110. Crowded into their secret world, they may not see daylight for weeks on end. Warspite's maximum speed is a secret. So is its maximum depth.
There you go, and it's gone. So what do I mean by safe depth? We have to be cognizant of shipping around us where we're maneuvering our submarine. So we like to put a bit of space between the top of our submarine and any ships. Now, the deepest draft ships in the world currently are around the 90-foot draft. These are big, huge super tankers. Therefore, we would keep about 180 feet as our safe depth, and then that would give us about a 35-foot safety margin above the fin. Now, obviously, a 90-foot draft vessel is not in every part of the world, so this can be adjusted slightly, but this is the common calculation that we use for safe depth, and that's the safe depth we invariably used on a diesel submarine was 180 feet. Another aspect of keeping safe is what we call the go deep circle. That means that if a ship's going to break inside the circle, we know how long it takes us to get down to our safe depth or a depth that will avoid this ship. We have to then take action to make sure we go under before that ship potentially hits us. So here we have a ship that's approaching. It attached our go deep circle. We know it's within range, so we'll flood some tanks. We'll put the power on, put the planes down, and we'll drive the submarine downwards so that the ship will pass over the top of the submarine safely. And this range will depend on the speed of the ship, and also your safe depth will depend on the depth or how much that ship draws. Okay, so we're now deep in the ocean. So how do we know our way around? What do we know what's around? How do we know what's around us? How on earth do we? As you can see, there's no windows on the submarine, despite what you see on the movies. And so we rely on hydroacoustic devices. There's a huge bow array, there's flank arrays, And then there'll be a whole mix of different sonars, echo sounders, underwater telephone, intercept sonars. This is just purely just visualization for the audience. And these are the bow array, the flank array are all integrated into the system, so we can track ships and other submarines. Now, all sound is detected, is analyzed and tracked, and low frequency sounds can travel hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles underwater, low frequency. Obviously, high frequencies, shorter range, but they're all analyzed. And from that, we can deduce a lot of information from the noise. We can tell how many revolutions per minute a propeller is going. We can then work out how many shafts it has, how many blades the propeller has. We can also work out whether there's rough seas above, or how much the stern or how much the screws go in and out of the water. We can then determine the speed of the ship or vessel above us. And by analyzing other frequencies like the engine, gearbox, and pump noises, we can also identify some ships and submarines, uniquely identify in many cases. We can also pick up a low-flying propeller aircraft, and helicopters that are looking for us as well can also be detected on the sonar as well. As a matter of note, I'll just make a note that the propellers on nuclear submarines are highly classified for a wide range of reasons, so we don't want the opposition knowing our frequencies and our sound signature when we are underwater, so they can't detect us. And so we very rarely ever ping. So the movies you see where the pinging noise on submarine is complete nonsense, you very rarely ever ping. The underwater telephone is quite interesting because it's just an acoustic device, but the frequency is such that we pick up marine noise, dolphins, porpoises, that type of thing we can often hear on the telephone. And when we're going very, very slow speed, sometimes those mammals do actually come near the submarine, and we can actually hear them clicking, the click of their sonars. Quite interesting. And it's a good clue. Perhaps there might be another submarine around if there's an increase in biological noise. The other way we look what's behind us and around us, we tow an array behind us called a towed array. This is matched in with your flank array and your other bow array, so actually provide a much more comprehensive picture. And because the towed array is a long distance from the submarine, it's not subject to any noise or vibration from the submarine itself, and therefore is very highly sensitive to what's happening. In my days, this towed array was actually brought out by a tug and clipped onto the yacht, onto the submarine. But nowadays, it's actually reeled underneath the casing, it's kept under the casing, and there's hydraulics. In the Falklands War, we actually had one of these towed arrays behind us in the submarine. The upper echo sounder is used for looking at the ice. So we would get the ice thickness before we come up through the ice. We use our upward-looking echo sounder. And the downward-looking echo sounder would be used much the way you do on a yacht in piloted waters. But additionally, when we're dived, we can actually fix the position of the submarine by using bottom contour charts and running lines of sounding on the charts. And with mathematics and computers, we can actually calculate our position to a very high degree of accuracy just from mapping the bottom by taking the sounding off the bottom. And as navigating officer of Courageous, I actually navigated the submarine very safely between San Diego and San Francisco on 2 occasions using bottom contour navigation. We were dived. Once we left the bridge in San Francisco or the harbor in San Diego, we went dive and deep, and we used the underwater fixing method. Another aspect of submarine life and submarine operations is the fact that the submarine is actually covered in acoustic tiles. These tiles weigh 300 or 400 tons on most submarines. They're quite thick, range up to about 3 or 4 inches in some places. They have special shaped voids inside the rubber, which is matched to the frequency of high frequency sonars like you find on a torpedo or a ship, so that an incoming ping gets trapped inside the rubber and doesn't actually get you, so you don't get a return echo when you get pinged. But the rubber also provides a nice insulating area and stops any last minute vibrations leaving the hull and getting out of the water. So again, makes the submarine really silent and almost invisible underwater. water. But that brings me on to another aspect, and that's controlling noise is a key facet of life on board. We have noise rounds. We check there's nothing that's going to be touching the hull, like a bucket in the wrong place that's putting vibrations out to the hull. So noise is taken very seriously. We have quiet routines where we shut down some of the machinery, and even sometimes at very slow speed, we can actually shut down the pumps on the nuclear reactor and just use thermal cooling for a short period, though obviously there's a limitation on how much steam we can produce. But we can actually try and shut down things as much as we can on board a submarine. So how about staying in touch? How do we communicate? Well, submarines, as I say, very rarely transmit. That includes radio as well. So we in business of receiving messages. And because low frequency radio penetrates seawater down to about 50 or 60 foot, we can actually get messages at periscope depth by using some loops inside the fin. But once we go deep, we can tow a buoy behind us, and this buoy is kept under the casing, and hydraulically the flaps open. This buoy comes out and is towed along behind the submarine. It goes along about 8 feet below the surface, and we can pick up the radio signals, no problem at all. The other option is to use a wire, and this is a towed wire, and much the same principle. By adjusting the length of the wire and the speed of the submarine, you keep the wire again probably about 4 to 5 foot underwater, so it's not creating a wake on the surface, but just keep it just below the surface, and again you can pick up your radio signals. Okay, so we've talked about communication, we talked about seeing what's around us, but let's look at some basic submarine operations. Okay, so let's say we're down at 900 feet. That means there's a pressure of nearly 420 pounds per square inch on the submarine, on all systems in the submarine. So, can you just do anything you like down there? No, you can't, because it's dangerous to go too slow when you're deep. And it's also dangerous to go too fast when you're shallow and deep. So there's a certain operating parameters, much the way you have on some aircraft, as to what you can actually do depending on your depth and speed. Let's say something goes wrong. To get to the surface, you need both some buoyancy to try and regain some of the negative buoyancy by ditching the water out of the ballast tanks, plus you need speed. Without speed, it's highly unlikely you're going to get up. So going too slow when you're deep can put you at risk. So if you have a flooding incident or power loss, you may not make it back to the surface. Both Scorpion and Thresher never made it back to the surface and lost all their men on board because they lost propulsion at deep depth and weren't able to get up again. And know that if you have any form of leak or system failure of that deep depth, the water comes in at one hell of a rate. In shallower water, you need to think about, can we recover before we even hit the seabed? If we have a plane jam, can you recover before you actually hit the seabed? So again, there's a limitation on what you can do when the water gets shallower. If you go too fast and you have a plane jam, you're going to hit the bottom. Additionally, if you have a plane jam, or an incident, can you actually recover before you get to crash depth? Now, on HMS Repulse, we had a refit. We left the shipyard, and because of what I told you before about propellers, we had an old, some propeller that was not our normal propeller on the submarine, and we practiced plane jam. So we deliberately put the submarine at quite a steep angle. Steep, I mean about 10 degrees for a nuclear submarine, which is quite steep. And then you go through the drill saying plane jam, put the engines in reverse, below main ballast, and all that good stuff. And that's what we did. So we were doing the drill, but once we put the stern power on, we realized to our horror that the screw had no real stern power, had no effect on the submarine hardly. And we were drifting down quite deep. Below main ballast has very little effect actually when you're deep because of the pressure and the amount of water you can shift. But we did slowly recover. We didn't reach our crush depth or anything like that, and we recovered. But again, I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that it's not all easy going down there. You have limitations on what you can do at different depths and different speeds. Okay, that's basic operations. Let's look at an interesting operation. One of the operations we do is what we call an underwater look. It is what it means. We come up underneath the ship and we take photographs and video and audio recordings of the ship. Obviously, warships are the ones we normally do this on, but in the Falklands campaign, we actually did this on the Argentine hospital ship, purely as a drill for ourselves, to keep ourselves in good check. Here you come up astern of the ship, so the ship, if it's got any sonar system, you come up in its wake, so it can't pick you up, and you match the ship for speed, and then having calculated the depth that you want to do your pass at, you come up, and then you find the screws. Now, the procedure is the captain will normally have the attack periscope, which is taller, and the second in command will have the search periscope, which is slightly shorter, and that will have most of the video and camera recording equipment in. So you approach and you look through the attack periscope to see the sight of the propeller going round, and then you adjust yourself to make sure you pass slowly up one side of the ship. Now, one particular exercise on Otis, we do an exercise, so the ship knew that we were going to do an underwater look. It was told to steer a course and speed at a certain time, and that was our target, was to come up underneath it. Now, the routine is to calculate the depth. The captain does a calculation, the XO does a calculation, the third officer then checks it, and then you say that's the depth we could go under. That's based on the depth of the draft of the ship and the swell and sea. So we calculated this, and so we made the approach. We saw the screws, but as we are seeing the screws, we're off to one side. The captain's attack periscope started shaking violently, very violently, and it's obvious that we were touching the ship above us. So we immediately crash dived, lowered all the periscopes, and pulled away from the ship, and reported into the ship the fact that we had touched them. As it turned out, despite all our best endeavours, myself and the captain made the same mathematical mistake, and we were 10 feet out. It was lucky by chance that our approach didn't put us into the screws of the ship, and we passed, and so we came away. Now, if it had gone well, the normal procedure is you come up and you slowly increase your speed to go along the hull of the ship, and you take imagery, you take photographs, you take video, and you also take audio recordings of every aspect underwater of the ship. So you get its engines, you get the frequencies from its diesel engines, from its turbines, from the electrical equipment on board. You look at all the different outlets underneath the water where there's water coming in or out. And so the captain and the XO, like the captain and myself, we would give a running commentary of everything we saw, and that'd be recorded along with the sonar and all the information. So it's a complete intelligence gathering exercise. And then once you reach the bow area or just ahead of the ship, you then slowly drop down your speed and pass down the other side of the ship, collecting the same information, end up in the wake of the ship, go deep and haul away and take your records with you. So can you do this on another submarine? Interesting question. Yes, I guess you can and have. Well, I'm not saying whether have or haven't, but it can obviously done if it's done on another submarine that's on the surface. Obviously, doing another submarine while it's dived is probably not advisable, but we have had some submarines return back to harbour with what we call hitting a black iceberg. So I'm not sure how they do it, but I won't say. Let me then just finish off then with what type of other operations do we do, particularly at periscope depth. The submarine is a very versatile animal in so much that we can do a wide range of exercises or missions at periscope depth. In the diesel submarine, we did a lot of missions up in the Barents Sea, taking in intelligence, that's gathering radio, intercepts, and analysing what people are chattering about, watching any missile fire-ins or anything of that nature, taking photographs. of the shoreline. That can all be done from periscope depth. Another interesting thing that can be done at both at depth and at periscope depth mainly, and that is to put special forces ashore or into their own boats. And on the diesel submarine, we could have about up to 20 men. We put them underneath the casing, that's between the pressure hull and the outside of the submarine. They breathe on a breathing line that's down underneath the casing, and then we would dive with them underneath the casing a few miles away from the target. And then once we get near the target, we would tap on the hull, and the men would then swim out from the submarine and go wherever they wanted to go. In some submarines, we have a two-man chamber where we are able to put two men in and release them from deeper down, and that often along with their boat. So the boat will be in a capsule which gets released from the submarine. It's quite interesting to see the two men arriving on the surface, and almost immediately the rubber boat arrives on the surface with them. The two men clamber in, and the engine is started, and away they go. It's quite something to watch. One particular operation I did, which came to some grief, and I guess I could share it with you, was that on Courageous we were doing an exercise photographic take of a coastline, and it was very foggy, and the drill on the submarine is to keep the periscope down to the minimum amount of exposure, never normally more than 7 seconds at a time. The video you see in the moment is obviously not the norm. So, so as it was foggy and we couldn't get any bearings, the captain said, "Well, let's put a radio mast up and see if we can get a radio bearing." And that's what we did. We put a radio mast up. Myself and the weapons electrical officer tried to get a line of bearing. We got one line of bearing on the radio mast. The radio mast went back down. We then run the bearing line on. The captain then put up the radio mast again to stand by for the second bearing. We locked the radio system in, took a second bearing, and as we did that, the cross where the intercepted, where we fixed the submarine, placed us aground. And sure enough, within 1 microsecond of me shouting out, we can't be there, we were there, and we hit the rocks. We're a periscope depth, so it's just a question of blowing main ballast, and off we come, and to assess the damage. That particular incident earned me a letter from the Queen, giving her severe displeasure of my conduct, and the captain himself was court-martialed and said I had a letter of displeasure from the Queen as to my conduct. It's one of those no-win situations where we had to do this thing, and it ended in grief. But anyway, the captain eventually came on to become an admiral, and there's an old saying, you can have one court-martial per rank and get away with it. So finally, I'd like to finish the talk with, is it safe to come up? We've been deep. Is it safe to come up? How do we do? What do we do? If we're going to come up, there's a danger we could get clobbered by another ship. So we need to make sure it's safe before we come up. So to do this, we would circle around underneath the water. We would use mainly high-frequency sonars to check above us that there's nothing untowards and see whether it's safe. Now, it's all very well if the ship above is making some noise, an engine noise of some sort, we can pick it up and we can know whether it's safe to come up. That's not the situation with a yacht. So a yacht, doesn't make a noise. You don't have an engine, you're just sailing along and minding your own business. And this led to a very amusing incident in the Mediterranean on Otis. I was on the attack periscope. I was bringing the submarine up from deep, and I passed within about 20 foot of a yacht and saw a man peeing over the side. And so I was about 20 foot or so away from him. He was quite shocked to see this wake of periscope go straight past him. And amusing as it was, but it shows you the danger that I could equally well have been 20 or 30 foot to the other side, and I could have ripped a big hole in his yacht, and he would have gone down, and no one would have known any better. So the lesson there is, if you're in your yacht in deep water, run your echo sounder to make sure that the submarine doesn't come up and surprise you, particularly if you're peeing over the side. Then I think we'll complete my talk. I hope that it was answered some of the questions you may be having about what's life underneath the water. And I'll turn it over to our invigilator for questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. that